If you're a lineman in charge of keeping the lights on, Grainger understands that you go to great lengths, and sometimes heights, to ensure the power is always flowing. Which is why you can count on Grainger for professional-grade products and next-day delivery, so you have everything you need to get the job done. Call 1-800-GRAINGER, click Grainger.com, or just stop by. Grainger, for the ones who get it done.
Hey there, this is Alexis Knight. Welcome to True Crime, the Court of Public Opinion. I'm your host, guiding you through cases that have moved through the courts and reached a conclusion, but have left the public divided. These are not your typical cut and dried cases. These are the ones where the facts may be clear, but the truth, that's another story. Now imagine this. You are driving home on a Saturday night, and a minor car accident with another vehicle suddenly escalates. Words are exchanged, tensions rise, and before you know it, both parties are out of their cars, facing each other in a standoff. You reach for a weapon, feeling threatened. But as events unfold, it results in tragedy. This is exactly what happened in New Orleans back in 2016. Former New Orleans Saints player Will Smith and local resident Cardell Hayes crossed paths one night in what began as a routine fender bender. What followed turned a minor accident into a deadly encounter. By the end, Will Smith was dead, and Cardell Hayes faced charges that would divide the community. As we dig into the details today, we're faced with a question that's left many people torn. Was Cardell Hayes genuinely defending himself? Or did his actions cross the line? Was this self-defense or was this excessive force? Stick with me, and by the end of this episode, you're going to have the chance to decide for yourself. Was justice truly served? Or is there more to the story than meets the eye? On April 9th in 2016, in the heart of New Orleans, a night that began with celebrations for former New Orleans Saints player Will Smith and his wife, Raquel, turned into one of tragedy and loss. Will and Raquel had just finished a night out in the Lower Garden District when a minor car collision changed the course of their lives. Cardell Hayes, a local businessman, was driving an SUV that ended up rear-ending Will Smith's Mercedes. The two vehicles come to a stop, and then the situation escalates quickly from there. Witnesses described a heated argument between Smith and Hayes, with tensions boiling over as both men left their vehicles. The confrontation turned physical, and in the chaos of the moment, Hayes drew a gun and fired multiple times. Will Smith was struck several times and died at the scene. Raquel, who was also present, was hit as well, suffering injuries that required hospitalization. The tragedy was immediate and irreversible. Cardell Hayes remained at the scene, calling 911 and waiting for law enforcement to arrive. And from the very beginning, Hayes claimed he acted out of self-defense, saying that he believed Smith was reaching for a weapon and that he feared for his life. However, police found no firearm on Smith's person or in his vehicle, and this detail alone added fuel to a firestorm of public debate. As news of the incident spread, the New Orleans community found itself divided. Some saw Hayes' actions as a tragic but justified response from a man who felt threatened. Others questioned whether the use of lethal force was truly necessary, especially against an unarmed individual. With Cardell Hayes now facing serious charges, this case would soon move into the courtroom, where a question of self-defense would be put to the test. But for the residents of New Orleans, and for everyone affected by this case, the question remained: where should the line be drawn between defending oneself and going too far? For many in the New Orleans community, Cardell Hayes' response to Will Smith that night seemed like a tragic but understandable reaction, because in their view, Hayes found himself in a tense, high-stakes situation where a split decision could mean the difference between life and death. He was face to face with someone who, by all accounts, was visibly angry and appeared to be advancing on him. Hayes himself later testified that he felt cornered and genuinely believed that Smith might be reaching for a weapon. Supporters of Hayes' defense argue that in such an intense moment, it's very difficult to demand perfect judgment. When someone perceives an imminent threat, instinct often overrides any time for checking things out or measured reasoning. And they point out that in stressful situations, people commonly react based on their gut feelings rather than calculated thought processes. Things are happening too fast. There isn't even time to think. For Hayes, that gut feeling translated into a belief that his life was at risk, a feeling that many can empathize with, even if they can't condone the result. This perspective taps into a core argument that resonates deeply in debates around self-defense. Should individuals be judged solely on the outcome? Does intent play a role? Hayes, after all, did not plan to encounter Smith that night, nor did he go out with the intent to harm anyone. His supporters argue that his actions were purely a defense response in a situation that had spiraled out of control, and they contend that he should not be judged as though he acted with malice or premeditation. In fact, some point to cases where people have successfully argued self-defense under similar circumstances, even when their actions resulted in tragic outcomes. They argue that Hayes, as a civilian with no special training in conflict resolution, he can't be expected to react flawlessly in a situation fraught with fear and uncertainty. His supporters ask, how many of us, when faced with what we believe to be a deadly threat, could react with calm precision? For them, Hayes' actions, while undeniably tragic, reflect a natural human response to perceived anger. We all think that we have the right to defend ourselves because the laws say so. But did you know that there actually is no comprehensive national database, in the U.S. anyway, that tracks the successful rates of self-defense claims in murder cases? Each outcome depends on numerous factors, including the specifics of the incident, the jurisdiction, the presence of stand your ground laws, and, of course, potential racial biases. Just to give you an idea, in the fiscal year 2022, only about 0.4% of federal defendants were acquitted at trial with a self-defense. This low acquittal rate suggests that defenses, including self-defense, are not often successful at the federal level. Now, at the state level, we have like stand your ground law in Texas, which can influence the outcomes of self-defense claims. And for example, a study done by the Urban Institute found that in stand your ground states, homicides that were white shooters and deemed justifiable were only 17% of the time. So it's not in your favor, it's not a guarantee that this defense is going to work, and it's actually quite hard to fight. And that's just a little bit of information for you. For this case, some viewed Hayes' actions as a justifiable response to fear, and others believed his decision to use lethal force crossed a line. And here we have the argument why it is scary to think self-defense can work. They argued that in this case, the absence of a weapon in Smith's possession suggested that Hayes might have overreacted, allowing fear to override reason and leading to an outcome that some describe as disproportionate. And I'm going to pause here quickly. Can fear stop? Can you pause your fear in an intense moment and think about things? Is that even a reasonable request out of someone fearing for their life? What do you think if it were you? I mean, one of the key points raised by this argument, this group, is whether Hayes truly exhausted every option that he could before resorting to deadly force. And critics ask, could he have stepped back or maybe called the police rather than taking matters into his own hands? They point out that Hayes, as an adult and a business owner, had both the physical presence and maturity to defuse the situation without resorting to violence. For them, the tragedy lies not only in Smith's death, but in the missed opportunities for Hayes to walk away without any loss of life. And this perspective often brings up the question of responsibility in self-defense situations. And we're already discussing that. In their view, claiming self-defense requires not only a perceived threat, but also evidence that the individual had no other viable choices. And that's where everything gets sticky. Here, critics argue, Hayes' choice to confront Smith rather than retreat placed him in a more aggressive role than a defensive one, and they contend that in situations where one party is unharmed, the onus is on the person with the weapon to show restraint unless absolutely necessary. Moreover, some locals felt that Smith's status as a well-known public figure heightened the tragedy and added more complexity to the case. Will Smith was not only a former professional athlete, he was a beloved member of the New Orleans community. And for those who mourned his death, Hayes' actions were seen not as a personal response to fear, but more as a breach of community trust. And that's a big deal in a community. And they believe that in taking Smith's life, Hayes inflicted lasting harm on a community that admired and respected Smith, amplifying the sense of loss. The community itself, as a whole, as a collective, felt protective of someone they cared about deeply in their community. Should these cases be treated differently? Should Hayes have recognized, oh, this needs to be different? The community loves this man. How do we think like that in a moment of fear? This side of the debate asks a challenging question. When you are faced with a threat, does self-defense justify lethal force even if the other person is unharmed? For these individuals, Hayes' actions represent a moment where fear may have overtaken reason, leading to an irreversible and tragic outcome. Hayes says, "Here's a big guy coming at me. I thought he was reaching for a gun." Should he have asked him to tell him what exactly he was reaching for or doing? Is there time for that in something like this? Is that even reasonable? How long does a moment like this take? The Cardell Hayes and Will Smith case quickly became more than just a tragic encounter. As you can see here, it evolved into a focal point for heated public debate and intense media scrutiny, both locally and nationally. At the heart of the controversy lay two key issues: the validity of Hayes' self-defense claim and the larger implications for self-defense laws in Louisiana. In a city as culturally and socially connected as New Orleans, opinions were sharply divided, with the case revealing tensions around race, gun ownership, and the limits of personal responsibility. One major source of controversy came from the contrasting portrayals of the men involved. Will Smith, a former NFL player and beloved New Orleans figure, was remembered as a community hero, known for his charitable work and close ties to the city. His untimely death was a blow to many who admired him. Hayes, on the other hand, he was painted by some as overly aggressive, even reckless. The media coverage leaned into these portrayals, casting Smith as a sympathetic victim, and Hayes as a man whose actions needed serious scrutiny. This created a narrative where the public's perception of each man heavily influenced opinions about what had happened that night. Additionally, this case highlighted the challenge of interpreting self-defense laws in situations that unfold quickly and are fueled by intense emotions. Louisiana's laws provide individuals with certain rights to defend themselves, but cases like this underscore how complex these decisions can be when they're interpreted by the public. Hayes' supporters felt that he had every right to protect himself if he believed his life was in danger, while critics argued that his response was far too extreme. And this clash of viewpoints stirred public discussion on whether self-defense laws should be more restrictive or if they offer enough protection to individuals who feel threatened. And then race also entered the conversation, and this added another layer to an already divisive case. Will Smith was a Black public figure in New Orleans, and he had significant public support, which naturally shaped how some people viewed Hayes' actions. This racial dimension raised questions about whether Hayes, who is also Black, would receive a fair trial and whether his fear of being harmed could be seen as justified in the public's eyes. Local activists pointed out that self-defense cases are often subject to bias, with racial perceptions impacting the level of empathy afforded to those claiming self-defense. And finally, the role of the media in shaping public perception. We can't skip this. From the moment the news broke, local and national outlets framed the story in ways that amplified the public's emotional response. So we're talking about a case where emotions and decisions are at question, and what we're doing is we're riling up the public. We are amplifying their emotions. Headlines emphasized the tragedy. Talk shows questioned the legitimacy of Hayes' actions, stirring a sense of outrage among Smith's supporters and sympathy among Hayes' defenders. This media attention transformed the case into a public spectacle, with each new development stirring stronger opinions and deepening the divide. You know, it's almost like the media has puppet strings and they are herding the public like a herd of animals to opinions and ideas, setting the stage for what will happen when the trial comes and then throughout the trial as well. Our opinions, how the public reacts, are personal, yes, but they're also fueled by what we find out from the media. They do have a sense of control over how we are reacting. How do we feel about that? With information on the internet seemingly dissolving a bit in a way, and our only source of information we get online, we have social media, and we have the news. You know, are we getting all the information? Is it fair to us to even have an opinion out here in the public? We might need to start searching for the actual info if this is what's happening and we're just being routed around by what the media is telling us. Is it fair to this case? Is it fair to any case? This case had a lot going on, and people were only getting information from the media for the most part. But there was a lot going on here. Self-defense and responsibility. How does race come into play? How does the media come into play in shaping justice? With these forces at play, the question of whether Hayes' actions were justified remains as much matter of public opinion as it is of law. For many, the outcome left them wondering if justice was truly served, or if society's views on self-defense are too complex to settle with a single verdict. Let's take a look at the facts of this case. The events leading to the confrontation between Cardell Hayes and Will Smith, it began on an otherwise ordinary Saturday night in New Orleans. Will Smith and his wife, as I said, had spent the evening having dinner. They were out with friends. They were enjoying a meal. They were spending time in the city's vibrant Lower Garden district. It was a typical night for this couple, who were well known and respected in the local community. And as they drove home, the unexpected happened. A minor rear-end collision with Cardell Hayes' SUV. Minor rear-end collision. Initial reports indicated that Hayes, a local tow truck driver and father, had been driving cautiously that evening. He had reportedly been rear-ended himself earlier that night, which might explain why he was particularly sensitive to the fender bender involving Smith. Witnesses described Hayes as visibly agitated after the impact, and tensions rose quickly as both men got out of their vehicles. According to police records and eyewitness accounts, the confrontation escalated from verbal to physical in a matter of moments. Words were exchanged, and what began as a relatively minor traffic incident rapidly spiraled into something far more serious. Hayes claimed that he felt threatened by Smith's behavior and believed that Smith might be reaching for a weapon. In the moments that followed, Hayes reached for his own firearm, and in a quick succession of shots, he ended Will Smith's life. Right there in that moment. Now, Raquel Smith, who was present during the incident, was with Will Smith, was also struck and injured. She later testified to the traumatic events she witnessed, recounting the horror of seeing her husband shot right in front of her. Her account provided powerful testimony about the severity and suddenness of the confrontation, painting a vivid picture of how the incident unfolded. Law enforcement responded promptly, and Hayes did not flee the scene. Instead, he stayed. He called 911 himself, a detail the defense would later emphasize as evidence of his sincerity and belief that he had acted in self-defense. Police soon arrived, taking Hayes into custody and beginning their investigation into what exactly had transpired. One of the most significant details uncovered by investigators was the absence of any weapon on Will Smith or in his vehicle, and this fact became central to the case, challenging Hayes' self-defense claim and casting doubt on his perception of the threat. With no weapon on Smith, the prosecution would later argue that Hayes' fear was unfounded and that his use of deadly force was unjustified. As investigators pieced together the events of that night, they uncovered details that would play pivotal roles in shaping both the prosecution's and the defense's cases. Cardell Hayes' background was examined closely. He was known in the community as hardworking, a local business owner, and a father. There was no significant criminal record or history of violence associated with Hayes, which bolstered his defense's argument that he had no intent to seek out or provoke a dangerous situation. And then you have Will Smith. His background was equally scrutinized. As a former NFL player for the New Orleans Saints, he was a celebrated figure in the city. Known for his charitable work and involvement with the local community, he was beloved by many. This high profile would amplify public interest and make the loss felt even more deeply in New Orleans. To many, Smith represented strength, resilience, and pride in a city that valued its local heroes, a perspective that influenced public opinion from the beginning. A critical aspect of the case was witness testimony. Numerous bystanders had seen the initial collision and observed parts of the confrontation, and their accounts varied. Some witnesses described Smith as appearing angry and physically confrontational, suggesting that he may have approached Hayes in a manner that could be perceived as threatening. This testimony bolstered Hayes' defense, implying that he could have had responsible cause to feel threatened. But on the other side, there were witnesses that presented a very different picture. They described Hayes as the more aggressive one of the two, seemingly ready to escalate the conflict. This divergence in witness statements created ambiguity around what truly happened in those crucial moments, leaving room for interpretation and argument in the courtroom. With conflicting witness accounts, this case took on an added layer of complexity, as neither side could fully rely on any narrative. The forensic report added another dimension to this case. The autopsy confirmed that Will Smith had been shot multiple times, including once in the back, which became a focal point for the prosecution. They argued that shooting an unarmed man in the back suggests a degree of excessive force inconsistent with self-defense. The defense countered, claiming that in the chaos and fear of the moment, Hayes may not have registered the exact positions of each shot, but rather acted in the belief that his life was in immediate danger. Together, these details and witness statements, forensic evidence, and the absence of a weapon on Smith formed the basis of a case that was as complex as it was tragic. The facts provided support for both sides, with Hayes insisting he felt genuinely threatened, while the prosecution argued that his actions showed a dangerous overreach of force. Let's look at the arguments. In building their case, the prosecution aimed to dismantle Cardell Hayes' self-defense claim by emphasizing that Will Smith had been unharmed and that Hayes' response was not only excessive, but unjustified. They argued that in Louisiana, where self-defense laws do provide some protection to individuals who feel threatened, certain standards must be met. To claim self-defense, they contended there must be clear and reasonable evidence that one's life was in imminent danger. And in their view, Hayes' belief did not meet that standard. One of the prosecution's most compelling points was the forensic evidence showing that Smith had been shot multiple times, including once in the back. And so for them, this was a critical detail. They argued that the shot to the back indicated Hayes' actions went beyond the realm of self-defense, suggesting an intent to harm rather than merely protect himself. According to their narrative, Hayes' use of force was not proportionate to the threat he perceived. Rather, they argued, he acted out of anger or fear in a way that escalated rather than mitigated the situation. The prosecution also brought attention to witness accounts that portrayed Hayes as the aggressor. Several witnesses reported seeing Hayes approach Smith in a confrontational manner, which they claimed undermined his defense. By emphasizing these accounts, the prosecution painted a picture of Hayes as someone who was not reacting to a threat, but instead willing to engage in a confrontation. This interpretation, they hoped, would convince the jury that Hayes had options other than lethal force, options he did not take. Additionally, the prosecution underscored the lack of any physical weapon on Smith's person or in his vehicle. Nothing was visible. Without any evidence of a weapon, they argued, Hayes' belief that Smith posed a lethal threat was speculative at best. They asserted that it was unreasonable for Hayes to conclude that his life was in immediate danger, as there was no direct evidence to support that belief. And finally, the prosecution emphasized the emotional toll of the incident, calling Raquel Smith to testify about her injuries and the trauma of losing her husband. Her testimony served as a poignant reminder of the consequences of Hayes' actions, and it added weight to the argument that the tragedy was avoidable. For the prosecution, Hayes' decision to fire his weapon went beyond protecting himself. It crossed a moral and legal line, resulting in the unnecessary death of a community figure. We always have the other side. And in response to the prosecution's claims, the defense built a case around Cardell Hayes' perception of immediate danger. They argued he genuinely believed his life was threatened during the confrontation with Will Smith. The defense contended that under Louisiana law, an individual is permitted to defend themselves if they reasonably believe they are facing a deadly threat. For Hayes, they argued this belief was not only reasonable but unavoidable given the circumstances that night. Central to the defense's argument was Hayes' state of mind and the events leading up to the confrontation. They highlighted that Hayes had been rear-ended earlier that evening, causing him to feel on edge. Whenever we're in an accident, we can feel on edge. When Smith's vehicle then rear-ended his SUV later that night, Hayes' anxiety increased. It made him feel vulnerable and wary. According to the defense, this heightened sense of caution colored Hayes' perception of Smith's actions, and his fear escalated when he saw Smith advancing on him in an aggressive manner. The defense also focused on witness testimony that described Smith as appearing angry and physically confrontational during the incident. They argued that Hayes' beliefs that Smith might be armed was a reasonable assumption under the circumstances, especially given the verbal and physical nature of the altercation. By emphasizing this perspective, the defense aimed to establish that Hayes' actions, while tragic, were a reaction to what he interpreted as an imminent threat to his life. In countering the prosecution's focus on the forensic evidence, the defense asserted that Hayes did not intend to shoot Smith in the back, but rather acted out of instinct in a chaotic, rapidly unfolding situation. They argued that in such moments, individuals do not have the luxury of calculated decisions or careful targeting. Instead, the defense maintained that Hayes' reaction was an automatic response to protect himself, and that the positioning of the shots was incidental rather than indicative of malicious intent. The defense also presented Hayes' decision to remain at the scene and call 911 as evidence of his sincerity and lack of intent to commit a crime. They argued that if Hayes had intended to harm Smith with malicious intent, he wouldn't have stayed and cooperated with law enforcement. For the defense, this behavior aligned with someone who believed he had acted lawfully and did not view himself as guilty of a crime. In closing arguments, the defense reminded the jury that self-defense is often imperfect and that individuals cannot be expected to act with precision in moments of intense fear. They urged the jury to consider Hayes' fear and his limited options and the overall context of the encounter, asking them to see his actions as those of a man who believed he had no choice but to protect himself. As the case progressed, the arguments from both sides left the jury with the difficult task of determining whether Cardell Hayes' actions were justified as self-defense or constituted an excessive use of force. The prosecution's case focused on the absence of a weapon on Will Smith and the multiple gunshots, including one in the back, and this posed a significant challenge to Hayes' self-defense claim. They emphasized that for self-defense to be valid, Hayes' fear must be deemed reasonable, and the jury was urged to consider whether Hayes could have handled the situation differently. In contrast, the defense's portrayal of Hayes as a man reacting out of a genuine fear presented an equally compelling narrative, and they framed Hayes as someone who had no time to assess alternative responses. He was in the heat of the moment and genuinely believed that his life was at risk. By focusing on Hayes' own perception of the threat rather than objective evidence of an actual weapon, the defense made the case that fear alone, if sincere, could justify his response. Throughout deliberations, the jury wrestled with these conflicting viewpoints. They were tasked not only with interpreting the legal definitions of self-defense under Louisiana law, but also with navigating the complex emotional dimensions of the case. Testimony from witnesses, forensic evidence, and personal accounts from Hayes and Raquel Smith all came together to create a picture that was anything but straightforward. Media attention surrounding the trial added another layer of pressure, with public opinion in New Orleans divided. Many in the community were calling for accountability for Smith's death, especially given his status as a public figure, while others sympathized with Hayes' actions and questioned how they might have reacted in his shoes. This public scrutiny created a challenging atmosphere for the jury, with the weight of community expectations potentially influencing their decision-making process. For many in New Orleans, this verdict did little to settle the larger debate around self-defense and gun violence. The decision left some feeling that justice had been served, while others felt that the punishment was either too lenient or too harsh. In this way, the verdict not only concluded a legal battle, but it left the community divided, with ongoing questions about where self-defense ends and accountability begins. As we have explored today, the case of Cardell Hayes and Will Smith is more than just a legal matter. It's a mirror reflecting the challenges we face in understanding self-defense, responsibility, and the boundaries of personal protection. Hayes claimed he acted out of fear, believing his life was in danger. But with Smith unarmed, others question whether that fear justified the use of deadly force. And now it's your turn to weigh in. Imagine yourself in Hayes' position, feeling vulnerable, maybe even cornered, with someone you perceive as advancing toward you as a threat. Would you in that moment act as Hayes did? Or would you hold back, hoping the situation would be resolved without escalating anything further? How would you know what you would do? Have you ever been faced with a man of large size coming at you? How long does it take to react, and how can we predict how we would react? And can laws that blanket things handle all the different situations and the different people involved and how they would react? Is it fair? Let's look at Will Smith's perspective. You're out with family. You're facing an unexpected confrontation. How would you want others to respond to you? Would you know for certain that how you think you are acting and presenting yourself is how others are perceiving you? Is there a clear line between defending oneself and going too far? Ultimately, cases like this one challenge us to consider not only the letter of the law, but also the spirit of our values around justice and safety. And perhaps with situations like this, is there a change that should happen around situations like this and the laws that are in place that don't seem to cover every situation and every person in every mental state? What role does fear play in our choices when life is on the line, and do the current laws cover for that? And with the percentages I shared with you, do you still feel that defending yourself is worth it and will be backed by the stand your ground law or other laws out there? Think about it. And thank you for joining me in exploring this controversial case in True Crime, the Court of Public Opinion. Stay safe out there, guys. Think critically, ask questions. And until next time, this is Alexis Knight.